As we sit in our 80s nostalgia clubs, drinking our expensive Pepsis and our self-tying shoes, waiting for the inevitable victory by the Cubs in the World Series, let's look back to the past at a film called Back to the Future. It started with Bob Gale, frequent writing partner of Robert Zemeckis and collaborator with director Steven Spielberg. I'll get into one of the trio's previous partnerships next week. What matters now is that Gale was looking through his basement and happened across his father's high school yearbook. Reading through it, he realized his father had been worlds apart from Gale himself when he'd been in school. Class president versus school rebel. And he wondered if he'd have been friends with his father if they'd attended the same high school. The idea of parent and child suddenly the same age in high school, was the first seed for this film. They approached Frank Price of Columbia and pitched the idea, who thought it had promise and offered a development deal. They worked at it, but the first draft felt too rough for Price. Plus, he was expecting something with similar comic sensibilities to Used Cars, something a bit more raunchy. That wasn't the way they really wanted to go with this, so they opted for what's called a turnaround deal. What that means is that even though Columbia paid to have the script made, another studio could purchase it, and in so doing, pay Columbia as well. So the two Bobs would need to shop around. The team had been with Spielberg since leaving film school, Zemeckis having already been an admirer of the famous director 2 years before Jaws made him a household name, and had approached him after a screening at USC of one of his films. Naturally, while they'd been working on Back to the Future, they'd shown it to Spielberg, who loved the idea. But ironically, given the subject matter, the timing was wrong. Gale and Zemeckis had done the films I Want to Hold Your Hand, followed by 1941, followed by Used Cars. And two of those three were box office duds, and the third being disappointing and critically panned. Because of that track record, nobody was interested in the film, convinced it was another idea that was going to fall on its face. The only thing that would convince them to even consider it was if Spielberg was on board, which he absolutely was. Except Zemeckis didn't want to bring him into it yet. He had been hoping to direct eventually and was worried that another dud would ensure that he would never get the chance, that he'd be seen as just some loser riding Spielberg's coattails. So he asked that this time he be allowed to stand on his own 2 feet. Back to the Future is a fusion of two ridiculously different ideas. It's a science fiction adventure, and it's a teen comedy. Imagine someone trying to do a fusion of Porky's and Star Wars, and you get the picture. Fitting those two together is going to be box office poison. Now add in, oh yeah, and it's also a period piece. And trying to find the right way to present that was not going to be easy. Gale and Zemeckis went to several studios, showed their ideas, and were told, sorry, it's not risque enough for us. They were like, teen comedies need more. Guys watching girls in the shower or changing in their bedroom. Let's see some titties. And the two were like, but it's his mom. Finally, they went to Disney and explained the plot. And then they got to the kiss in the car, and Disney was like, but it's his mom. And they rejected it for being too risque. So the two Bobs finally sat on the film, waiting for the future when the world was going to be ready for it. What they didn't know was that, while the duo was struggling with their string of disappointing films, an equally frustrated waitress was looking for her big break. Her name was Diane Thomas, struggling to break into the business, and so wrote the script called Romancing the Stone. This was made before Raiders of the Lost Ark, which it would later be compared to, and she sold the script to Michael Douglas less than a week after she had finished it. He saw it as a chance to boost his film career with an exciting leading man role. Studios weren't as convinced, so Michael Douglas finally got it moving forward, but with very limited support from 20th Century Fox. He decided to gamble on Robert Zemeckis, described at the time as, quote, that whiz kid who wrote great films that bombed. Romancing the Stone was a bit of a strained production, and when the rough cut of the film came in, 20th Century Fox execs were so sure it was going to flop, they fired Zemeckis off the film Cocoon before he could even get started on it. Well, for the second time this month, the suits were dead wrong on that, as Romancing the Stone proved a massive success, propelling its three principals to stardom. Danny Devito had been seen only as that jerk on Taxi for a long time, but this really started to change his reputation. And Robert Zemeckis? He was the golden boy again. Diane Thomas not only received $250,000 for the script, Douglas personally gave her a Porsche Carrera as a little incentive to work on a sequel for him, and she was hired on to work as a script doctor by Steven Spielberg. Tragically, she would die in that car. Her boyfriend had been drinking and drove it into a pole, killing her and the other passenger. Not only tragic for its human loss, but likely denying the world many great films that she could have conceived. But Zemeckis now found himself in a great position. He had just become the hottest new director in town and had a free schedule, meaning this was the moment that he could make a move on Back to the Future. Right now, he was a hot new director. If he'd gone on to Cocoon and it didn't meet expectations, then Zemeckis could have suddenly found himself the loser whiz kid again, and the film might never have been made. Instead, his reputation was at an all-time high, and he could talk seriously about getting the film made. In fact, suddenly all those people who said no to Back to the Future were suddenly his best friend in the world. No, before he went back to them, he wanted to visit the person who believed in it when nobody else would. And even though Spielberg had become a living legend by now, he was still on board to be executive producer. And in fact, it would be the first film that Amblin Entertainment set up that wasn't being directed by Spielberg himself. So they went to Universal, and it just so happened that Frank Price had moved from Columbia to Universal. Ah, the guy who set the wheels in motion. Should make this easier, yes? No, and not for the reason you probably think. It had nothing to do with Price wanting a titty teen picture. It was because Price had rejected E.T. based on some research-based bullshit reasoning that had really pissed off Steven Spielberg. Given that animosity, Spielberg didn't want to work with Price. But being able to make this hot picture, well, Universal was willing to be flexible about it. In fact, they worked directly with Sid Sheinberg, who was the head of the studio at the time. He did have some conditions of his own, though. One was that Professor Brown was to become Dr. Brown, Doc for short, but that wasn't a big deal. Doc Brown's chimpanzee Shemp, though, that had to become a dog, confusing them, and even more so when he said, "No movie with a chimpanzee has ever made a profit." They said, "What about Every Which Way But Loose?" He said, "That's an orangutan." So, species reassignment, not really a big deal. But he wanted to change the title of the film. Films with future in the title don't sell, he said. His alternative? Spaceman from Pluto. They were confused, but it was based on the scene with Marty arriving in the 50s and mistaken for a spaceman. It sounded terrible, and seemed likely to confuse people over what the film was supposed to be about. But Spielberg by this time had his fingers so on the pulse of Hollywood, he knew exactly how to handle this. He sent back a memo congratulating him on the joke memo that he had sent out about that spaceman from Pluto thing. Good one there, Sid, good one. He knew that Sheinberg would be too prideful to admit that something everybody found so ridiculous they thought it was a joke was actually said seriously. So, Back to the Future it was. The script went through several changes due to a number of factors. Originally, the time machine was a stationary device, more like a big car wash you step inside of. Others compared it to a refrigerator. But that was a big reason for the change, as there was fear that children might imitate the film and climb into an actual refrigerator and die. What's more, Marty, with everything in his life going wrong, enters the time machine thinking that it will shoot lightning into him and kill him. Realizing that teen suicide isn't exactly a good foundation for your comedy film, they changed it so the time machine was a car and Marty would be driving it. It wasn't the only change. The studio had some financial trouble. Part of the reason Spielberg was such a hero to Universal was because E.T. had set a new box office record when the studio desperately needed a hit, so they needed things to be a bit less epic for Back to the Future. Originally, the fact that the car is nuclear was meant that Marty would return thanks to the power of an atomic test. By saying that the nuclear reaction in the car creates electricity that powers it, they could get away with a lightning strike, which of course can happen in practically any set that you please. Thus, they were able to keep the whole thing in Hill Valley instead of having to set parts of it out in the desert and on location for this very elaborate detonation. Similarly, a sequence involving a train during the chase scene was lost to keep things on the Hill Valley set. The irony of this is that the way studios view science fiction these days, today they would insist that Back to the Future have the atomic bomb to fit in their big dazzling special effect for the movie. Other changes were made for various reasons. Originally, Marty and Doc were friends because they were partners as media pirates, but naturally studios didn't want to show a media pirate as the hero. It was changed to Doc showing up at the door and hiring Marty to clean his garage, but that seemed out of character. In the end, they just left this unexplained, reasoning simply that children are often intrigued by eccentrics, and it wouldn't be surprising if Marty checked out the weirdo that everyone said to stay away from and decided that he was actually an okay guy. It was part of an overall effort to clean up the character's images, and similar things happened to others. Biff's catchphrase of butthead replaced his original catchphrase, asshole. And not only did Doc Brown originally get the idea for time travel when one of the girls at a party he was with hit him over the head with a broken bottle, he was the one who stole the plutonium rather than being appropriated by terrorists. And Doc's death isn't the result of terrorists in a VW microbus. He's assassinated by government agents. It was also intended that Marty changed the future, but this came through in various ways. In one version, George becomes a boxer. In another, rock and roll is rejected by society because Marty started a riot, and Doc Brown's understanding of how Coca-Cola makes his time machine work leads to him inventing flying cars by the time Marty returns to the future. There were naturally other changes. The script had years of redrafting, of course, but probably the most pointless change was insisted on by Sheinberg, that the mother be named Lorraine after Sheinberg's own wife, Lorraine Gary, who a few years later would get further indulgence when Sheinberg got a movie made for her called Jaws the Revenge, Home of the Voodoo Shark. But at the other end of the scale from a name change was the release date. It had to be ready for release the last weekend in May. That was the deal breaker. The problem was that everyone involved agreed that the one to really fill Marty's shoes was Michael J. Fox, who had emerged as the focal point character in the show Family Ties because Meredith Baxter Birney was pregnant. There was no way they could film the entire movie in the tiny window between the end of Family Ties shooting and the release date. So grudgingly, they had to go looking for someone else. Spielberg suggested C. Thomas Howell, who had worked with him on E.T., but the studio wanted Eric Stoltz instead. They were just wrapping up a film called Mask that they knew was going to be big and felt this would be a chance to cash in on Stoltz's inevitable popularity. So certain was Sheinberg that he told Zemeckis that if it didn't work out, he could replace him. Fox wasn't the only actor they wanted but couldn't get. The role of Dr. Emmett Brown was supposed to go to John Lithgow. He had appeared in that Peter Weller film that I mentioned in RoboCop, The Adventures of Buckaroo Banzai Across the Eighth Dimension, and Neil Canton, who was a producer on that film and this one, recommended him. But Lithgow already was committed to another project, so Canton suggested two other actors from the film, Christopher Lloyd, like Danny DeVito, also of Taxi fame, and Jeff Goldblum. Now, Goldblum could pull off the wacky scientist, but whether he could convincingly play the old Doc Brown was a concern. Nevertheless, he was a fallback option if Lloyd turned it down, who had also been offered a plump role in an off-Broadway play, but in the end he took the role that he is probably most famous for, and which was much beloved by Lloyd himself, so much so that he said he would actually consider playing Doc Brown again in a Back to the Future 4 with the right script. Although that could be to dispel rumors, because if you type his name into Google, one of the top most related searches is Christopher Lloyd dead. For Tom Wilson, this was his first real film, and he was very excited about it naturally, but had a bit of a conflict with their star. Stoltz was very into the role, and that role included being very physical with Biff, which he did despite Wilson asking repeatedly to dial it down. Instead, he dialed it up until Wilson went home bruised. After that, there was restrained animosity between the two, and Wilson was looking forward to paying Stoltz back in the scene where Biff pulls Marty out of the car and punches him. He would never get the chance. Zemeckis shot for 4 weeks, then visited Spielberg with 45 minutes of edited footage to get a second opinion, and both were in agreement. Eric Stoltz was a fine actor, but he just wasn't Marty McFly. Stoltz was very method, like Weller in last week's RoboCop, and like him wanted to be called by his character name on set, not his own. This technique no doubt contributed to success, playing the young man with the deformed skull and mask. Now on this film and going, "What is so funny that I fall down while pulling on my pants?" And "This is so sad, Marty returns to a family he's never known." He was a completely wrong fit to the part, and even said so after a while. He was a serious actor, not a comedy one. And however good you are as an actor, there's an old saying, death is easy, comedy is hard. Lloyd understood that, and was stealing every scene from Stoltz that they were in together. This was a rough situation for everyone, and Zemeckis was looking at not only years of work for himself and Gale going up in smoke, but that if this film flopped, which seemed likely based on what they'd shot, Romancing the Stone would be written off as the anomalous success in a disappointing career, and he'd never direct again. He may not even write again. But Spielberg was committed to the project and to Zemeckis, so he did two things. One of them was to go with Zemeckis to see Sheinberg and explain the situation. Explain how they were going to get out of this situation then, and how much more it was going to cost to do it. And Sheinberg, to his credit, approached this very rationally, saying something to the effect that if new wunderkind Zemeckis and film deity Spielberg both come into his office and tell him that the film is broken, it would be idiotic to argue that it isn't. He'd back them up and come up with the money. So the Eric Stoltz Marty McFly, in the words of Doc Brown himself, was erased from existence. The new plan involved starting the whole thing over with Michael J. Fox like they'd originally wanted. Spielberg happened to be really good friends with Gary David Goldberg, founder of Ubu Studios, as in Sit Ubu Sit, heard at the end of every episode of, yes, Family Ties. The two had a meeting and it was agreed. Fox could do the movie and the show at the same time, provided the show always had priority. It was grueling to say the least. Fox would work on Family Ties all day, then get picked up and brought to do night shoots for Back to the Future. Enough to get him on film and then literally carried while sleeping to get a bit of rest to do the whole thing all over again the next day. But Fox was in the moment Goldberg explained all of that. He'd seen them doing location scouting while he'd been working on Teen Wolf, a film he did because it had a good paycheck and could be shot in a month. In fact, when he saw them, he wanted to go over and talk to them about being in the movie, but he was wearing this stupid werewolf makeup that just made that situation impossible. Goldberg handed him the script, but Fox didn't even open it. He said yes immediately. Because the film follows Marty almost exclusively, the only things they could shoot were parts of scenes when he wasn't actually on camera. Day scenes would be filmed on the weekends when he didn't have to shoot Family Ties, and perhaps even allow him to sleep on a bed instead of in the arms of a strange man. And they found they could salvage a great deal of what they had shot with Stoltz, long shots so the figure is too tiny to matter, scenes when he was off camera or only had a limb on camera, like when Marty takes a swing at Biff. The weirdest casualty of the whole affair was that the actor cast to play Marty's girlfriend was replaced as well. She was absolutely perfect in every way save one. She was now too tall standing next to the leading man. The crew, especially the women, just didn't think that her towering over Fox on set looked right. So sadly, she had to be let go. And it wasn't the only issue with Fox's height. Many of the props had been built with Stoltz in mind, and now they were rigging things up because Fox was unable to reach the props now. When there's trouble on the set, the studio gets very nervous about the film. So given how big this disaster was, it was moved to August, often considered the dumping ground for summer movies the studio isn't confident in. But then the test screenings came in and the audience loved it. And the executives sat down to watch it, and they loved it. Sheinberg was like, screw August, whatever it takes to get this in for a July 4th weekend release, do it. It was notable because they saw it in the Hitchcock Theater, which is supposed to be cursed because no good film had ever been seen there. So when asked about it afterwards, whether the curse had finally been lifted, Sheinberg supposedly said, "The curse of the Hitchcock Theater has been shitty movies." According to critics and moviegoers, Back to the Future was anything but, spawning 2 sequels and animated series from the success of a movie that for years nobody wanted to touch and seemed doomed when it finally was. So let's take a look at the film itself, Back to the Future.